This is Dave Monk, Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial. And it's November the 22nd, and the topic will be vulnerability. Plus, if we have time, we'll look at canals. Okay. Vulnerability. We've been looking at various aspects of leadership and how we get to be able to do some of the tasks that require paperwork, require bringing people together, and one of the things that can get you sometimes is that you need to talk to people, and it may take you a long time to develop an interest. You can destroy that connection by taking a photograph of an architectural body where somebody lives. You can destroy it by various poor behaviors. You have to be a little bit vulnerable. It means that if you are going to encounter someone that you think has a historic building or a natural area, you need to establish yourself. And that's one of the problems that have been with voting behavior lately. Some people don't trust the voting behavior, so they clam up and don't exchange ideas or interests with people who are willing to share. It may be that you have someone all of a sudden adjacent to a natural area that's being planted, and to that person, that's a no-no. You need to check with that person, and it may take many years. But vulnerability for you is there. You have to let people know who you are, what you're doing, and why you're doing it. And even then, it may be criticized, and you have to be able to put up with that dimension and think what you can do gradually. It may be that the person on the other side is in line with what you're thinking, and it can happen very quickly. This week, I had a vulnerability situation. It was indeed a scam, and I'm fairly open to talking to people about the things we do. And so scam artists can be very genuine, and so you release some of your information when they ask. And so in this case, I had a bill with Amazon. Well, I hadn't been using Amazon. So this bill was $34.99. I called, or I emailed in to say that I didn't do this, and very kindly they were going to refund the money, which means that they want to have access to your account so that you can put the $34.99 into your account, which means that they're looking for more than $34. Mysteriously, the dot for or the comma for $34.99 became $3,499, which means that they're looking for um, bigger money, and they're also looking at see if you have relations to other people that they can also zap. Uh, that got to be a discussion of whether uh, we should pay the $3,000 or they. I objected to this. I didn't allow them into my uh, online banking, but they got there anyway. And uh, then I, uh, they wanted me to sign money over or take a gift certificate to Best Buy, uh, and so they could get the numbers. Then the very modest, genuine interaction became much more aggressive, and I was being threatened with arrest for fraud. And then I realized that this was indeed a scam. And uh, so that's the risk of being somewhat more vulnerable. Uh, so they wanted a signature for access to this account. And I said, no, this is a charitable trust account. And I'm not going to do that. And I'm not going to go out in the virus era and send you a gift certificate. Uh, so I checked with the bank, and there was this amount of money, $3,000, into my account. And then I checked again, and it was taken out of their account. So they didn't have to have me pay for that money. Uh, if I was careless, yeah, that would happen. But uh, the next time I checked with it, the $3,000 had disappeared, and I haven't heard from them since. But that's the sort of thing that can happen. So you have to be a little aware, but that shouldn't take away the genuineness of you being a little vulnerable, telling people what you do and why, and making a relationship uh, gradually. The Grand Prairie Friends has done it very well by having volunteers, and the volunteers get to know each other, and then they get to know what are concerns, and they can enlist a certain concern that might be just photography, or it might be uh, board rules, or it, it may be funding, but it may be just something simple and takes you further. And it depends on your uh, interest in what you're doing and your mission. So at this stage, I want to encourage you to actually be vulnerable, but be very careful. Uh, you can lose your soul. And sometimes, if you give away your intent, then people can take advantage of your intent and block what you're going to do. Uh, so that's my small rant at the moment. But I really encourage you to talk to each other, talk to each other about uh, your own life, but also about the mission that you're perhaps interested in, the agency, and gradually develop mutual confidence. I thought I would say something about canals. Canals are, uh, oh, let me set my clock. I think we're okay. Uh, Canals uh, could connect the hinterlands with oceans to the Atlantic and the Pacific, perhaps the Pacific. And eventually, the Panama Canal connected the Atlantic and the Pacific. Uh, Canals can take a river and rise it up over a hill or a mountain, and uh, they do that by putting in dams that create a body of water that allows shipping to have a draft. Uh, and then that body of water allows you to take, say, you're going uh, downhill, then you let that water into a lock that has gates on either end. The first gates are open, so you go in with the water at that level. Then the gates behind you are locked, and the gates at the other end are open. Uh, there's various ways of doing this, but early locks had a huge uh, batten that allowed manpower to push the gates open against water power. And then that lets the ship sink down. It might take 15 minutes for the water to escape. Then you're into another pool of water created by another dam. And uh, so very early on, when Joliet and others were exploring, they realized that the Lake Michigan and the Illinois River were very close together. There was a little ridge that had to be got over, but this was in the 1500s, and the suggestion was there. Uh, it did. It took till 1830s and 40s to put this into action. So the Illinois-Michigan Canal was created. It had to take water at the initial end of the Chicago River up and over a hill, and then into the headwaters of the Illinois River. That was quite a number of miles, possibly best part of 100, I'm not sure. And at various stages, you had to have locks that let you go down that ridge. And there's maybe 600 feet difference between the water in Lake Michigan and the water in the canal at La Salle, Peru. Or it may be that you're climbing a ridge and going down the other side. Early canals were debated for a long, long time. This is where you have to look at leadership that and interests. There are often public interests, and it would be very handy to have commercial connections between Chicago and the Mississippi River and New Orleans. Later on, it would be even similarly interesting to be able to go from La Salle, Peru to Rock Island on updated canal, which was a little wider and the locks were a little longer. So the early moves were to make a ditch that was about 6 feet draft, although it had various water levels depending on whether there was a drought and there wasn't much water, uh, uh, or whether it was flood time and it was a little difficult because of floods and barges and the like would float and leave their moorings and sink. The early boats were small, uh, less than 100 feet and about 15 feet wide, and with low draft. They weren't always flat bottom boats, but they could have a keel. They could have a very small keel. They could have a way of maneuvering with a, a rudder at the back, and uh, so you could use this canal, uh, hopefully, uh, for the summer months. When it came to be winter months, the canal was expected to be frozen and not useful. And uh, so the early moves were made uh, in divisions. There was an Eastern Division, a Western Division, and there had to be a hierarchy of engineers and administrators who could uh, do this sort of work. There had to be politicians who were willing to promote this work. It was before Abe Lincoln's time, but Abe Lincoln also had a, a sympathy for this sort of canal. The canal had to be dug through uh, glacial till, and then some places it might be sandy and it's not a good a place to. Uh, there was a leakage problem, and you. Then one of the stunts was to bring in clay and to make a clay embankment that it would uh, prevent some of the leaking. When you went over creeks and other rivers, you had to have an aqueduct that was going over that river. Uh, that was quite a challenge. Initially, it was created by boards and caulking, and uh, there may be a minimal leak, but it basically let shipping go across. The early trail had to have a towpath. These were early shipping was barges, and they had to be drawn through the canal. Uh, you had precedents for a Erie Canal coming through from New York to Chicago, but this was going from Chicago to LaSalle, Peru, to meet up with shipping coming up from the New Orleans to St. Louis to Peoria to LaSalle, Peru. So the tow you had to have a on top of the levee that was created by the soil that was removed. You had a towpath for donkeys. You had to have a system for housing donkeys. Donkeys couldn't go perhaps more than 12 miles, and they had to be changed. So you had to have uh, livery stables for horses and donkeys. You had to have drivers, and many of the drivers were teenagers because they didn't have to be paid so much. So there had to be uh, houses where the lock keeper could uh, stay and be there to meet shipping coming down or going up the canal. Uh, so all these uh, devices had to be uh, listed and engineered before there were any plans. Uh, it was obvious that if you only had a 6-foot canal, it was going to erode. If you dare not put a motorboat in here because you would have erosion of the banks, and then you'd have silt, and silt was a problem, and you had to have dredges that would take that silt out. Uh, and this was a major mechanism for transporting people. So you had to have uh, barges that would take people. And when you came to a lock, you had to have a mechanism whereby the ship could be pulled in and out of the lock that was beyond the towpath. All these things had to be considered. If you had uh, anything tall on your barge, it had to be taken down so that they could go under a bridge. Uh, and then you had to be worried about uh, people who lived on, worked on, had farmland on either side of the canal. So bridges had to be built that took uh, that sort of transportation. Uh, the towns were about the distance of a donkey's uh, trip. And so towns began to grow. The products were uh, mainly grain to start with, but also minerals from mining areas, and also lumber. Uh, the forest to the north of Illinois into Wisconsin and into Michigan and Ohio were rich in lumber, uh, mostly pine forests, and they were the forests that were providing the uh, lumber for the creation of uh, Chicago's suburbs. Uh, Sometimes the draft was heavy, so you sank lower, and that would put you into the mud. So the captains of these barges would be knowledgeable of those uh, areas and be able to uh, go around them a little bit, but not too much because this was a narrow uh, canal. So, to improve that situation, you took rivers that were running north, like the Rock River, and you went and dammed that river and allowed it to come through uh, a channel that was also a canal that connected up the canal, and that provided water for especially places like the Hennepin Canal. Uh, those waterways, the regular river would run under an aqueduct, but the bypass would come and provide water. Uh, the people moving was prior to railroads. Unfortunately, the the canals got into action just before the railroads, and the railroads were more flexible and more or less killed a lot of the uh, trucking and commodity movement on the canal. Uh, the two exist, and they still exist to today. Uh, Bigger and better shipping, and so different. Uh, the Illinois-Michigan Canal came down to LaSalle, Peru. You had to have areas where there was enough water for uh, the transfer of uh, products from these small barges to larger barges or ships. Some of the early ships were uh, also barges. Sometimes the lumber was uh, corralled together and created into a float, and you floated down the river. But you had to have someone that knew what they were doing to do that floating, because there were snags in the river, and there were rocks here and there, and there were rapids that were hard to negotiate. Uh, so the transport up the Mississippi was uh, mainly by paddle wheelers that had a paddle wheeler behind, a rear paddle wheeler, or side paddle wheelers. And if you were clever, uh, the side paddle wheelers could be uh, encouraged to move in different ways. It's a little bit like being on a bulldozer. If you block one cleat track, you can move the other cleat track around. Well, if you blocked one uh, or braked one paddle, the other paddle would move the ship around a little. The water in the Mississippi from about the uh, where the Illinois River and the Missouri River comes in is adequate enough that you didn't have to have a lot of locks, but you did have big meanders that took a lot of time to go around. So if you got smart, you took that gooseneck and you cut a cutting across it. When you do that, the river runs fast, and you have uh, challenge. So there were ships that knew how to get speed up and negotiate that sort of thing. So the river captains were very clever, and they also knew how to have captains and uh, 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 populations of people that could also have cargo at the same time. Well, when those ships got to uh, LaSalle, Peru, there had to be a staging dock, or an area where uh, those ships could exchange. Uh, then people got smart. They wanted to have a canal that went from LaSalle, Peru, across the northern part of Illinois to the Rock Island line, Rock Island area with the Quad Cities. That enabled traffic to come in from north, like Minnesota, down to uh, the Quad Cities and across to LaSalle, Peru, and up to Chicago, and the reverse. It also allowed you to work with Iowa and to take cargo down uh, past Clinton and past Palisades and and to Quincy and on the Mississippi. And you could also have the same uh, traffic of paddle wheelers coming up the Mississippi. So the Hennepin Canal, Hennepin was an early explorer, and the Hennepin Canal was made wider. So instead of about 15 feet for a barge, you could have about 30 feet for a barge, and it would be longer. So uh, traffic was good as long as it lasted. uh, and the day came when donkeys and horses were not enough for the. They were replaced by motors and tugs that sometimes pushed rather than pulled, and they were kept to 4 miles an hour, which was a boring speed and not an economic speed. After a while, they got up to 6 miles an hour, but that still was a long time, and you almost had to have sleeping quarters for the staff and for the visitors that were traveling on your barge. Uh, uh, it was quite an establishment, and when we think of leadership, to get this together was interesting. It was at the outset when Joliet was around. The area wasn't even owned. The Louisiana Purchase hadn't been created. Uh, but once that got created, there was a drive to move west. It had some problems with Indians that were being moved or almost forced out in the east and moved west, and there were uh, Chippewa and Sioux that had conflicts of their own, but also partially caused by humans. And there was a tremendous drive to settle the land. The railroads were coming through, and they were almost parallel to the canals or to the rivers. So uh, steam engines, and so they had to be manufacturing. And so in Wisconsin, you had areas where shipping was created, and it had to go through the. It had to be small enough to go through the Illinois-Michigan Canal. It, if it was the Hennepin Canal, it was a little wider. So, but as things matured, the Illinois-Michigan Canal opened in about 1848, uh, and then it quieted a little bit when you had a Civil War. Lincoln was quite sympathetic to putting in canals or utilizing them, but the concentration was on the Civil War. The traffic continued, and the railroads weren't always able to provide enough rolling stock to take grains, and that continues. And traveling grain by barge is much cheaper than traveling it by rail. So today you can go to uh, various places along the Illinois River and the Mississippi, and a lot of that grain goes out by barge, huge barge tows with multiple barges. Uh, the farmers didn't always like this because sometimes there was a leakage and it would flood their land. But they also benefited from a much cheaper travel through to places like Chicago, which before there was rail, it was a horse and buggy, horse and wagon style thing. Sometimes people, instead of selling corn grain, they sold alcohol. They allowed it to ferment, and it was easier to transport alcohol than it was to transport grain. Uh, you have that today. We have lots of ethanol produced by fermenting grain. and it goes into our gasoline, and we use it uh, in cahoots with regular gasoline. Uh, some of this corridor was useful for uh, that connection and needed to be bigger and better. So uh, there were attempts to widen and deepen the channel, and that was uh, okay, but too expensive. And eventually, an Illinois shipping canal was created, which can take quite large ships. And during the war, that canal allowed uh, submarines and other uh, shipping, ocean shipping, to be built in places like Wisconsin and then come down to uh, the bottom of Lake Michigan and into the Illinois Michigan Canal and through to the South Peru and uh, on. Sometimes the uh, equipment was put on huge barges and they were pushed down to New Orleans that way. Uh, I'm trying to think. Uh, the railroads came through almost adjacent, so the people that traveled could use both. So Lincoln, when coming uh, from Washington when he was a senator, came by barge from uh, along the Erie Canal and got to Chicago that way and got to LaSalle, Peru by the Illinois Michigan Canal, but then had to take a train to Peoria and to Springfield. Uh, uh, a long, slow trip and very multinational. People had to uh, dig these canals, and they were from different ethnicities. Uh, uh, the Irish were very anxious to get jobs of this nature because in Ireland they were having things like a potato famine, and uh, uh, they were glad to be here. There were even conflicts between the Northern Islanders and Protestants and the uh, regular islanders that were mostly Catholic. And that sort of conflict continued into Illinois. There were gangs in different places, and there had to be a human element that was considered. The barracks for these people were simple, and but they did earn money until the railroad organization really took over. Uh, some of the techniques changed. Uh, they discovered uh, cement, and so the limestone, which underlaid some of the glacial uh, till that was brought in from Canada by glaciation. Uh, Underneath there was water-worn sedimentary rocks, and uh, they created waterfalls, and they also could be used uh, to create pedestals and to create locks. Uh, so concrete replaced those rocks when the canal uh, locks broke down. Uh, they had to have aprons so that shipping uh, could nudge its way into a lock, and often those were elements of stone. You could saw sandstone or limestone, or uh, it was mostly limestone that was used. Uh, the waterfalls sometimes were created uh, by limestone being rather impervious to water, and underneath uh, softer rocks could be uh, burrow under the limestone, and so the water would come to the end of the limestone and drop over and create uh, a site where a barge could reach, but not reach up onto the higher level without a fairly serious uh, lock. Uh, when the Illinois Michigan Canal was retired, I think it was in 1933 or somewhere like that, in Depression years. It was getting too costly to uh, pay the salaries of the tenants that were uh, the caretakers, the maintenance people. So, and it was a depression time, and nobody had any money, and the state didn't have any money. So the uh, canal that went from LaSalle, Peru across northern Illinois, it was closed, and also the Michigan Canal was closed. The the canals are still there. You can go to Lockport, and you can visit a museum which relates to the canal days. And then right next door is the ditch that was the canal. And you have to wonder at the people who decided to do this, and the cooperation in the long run, and the royal opposition, and just getting such a huge project into action and then losing it. Uh, and there had to be an administration, and for some reason or other, it got to be the Army Corps of Engineers, and the Army Corps of Engineers uh, did a very good job. They assessed these places, and they created safety, and they were also concerned about the commerce, and to this day they were uh, in charge of the canals. When they were closed, the Army Corps of Engineers had to be uh, uh, honest and uh, realize that the amount of cargo going down these canals was getting less and less, and the people moving was less and less. There was a little recreation. Uh, uh, there was the local uh, canoe or flat bottom boat or uh, uh, motorboat, or but then there were also rich boats that were a little larger, and some of them were powered by steam, and some were powered by uh, gasoline engines. And if they had a smokestack, it had to be one that would lie down so they could go onto the bridges. So there was still a little bit of activity right across to the Quad Cities. But the area was closed, and it was given to the Department of Natural Resources uh, to look after. Department of Natural Resources, interestingly, controls mining. Sometimes one of the products that was here was sand. If you go to Starved Rock, you have the awkward situation where you have very good sand that's good for making glass and doing other things with it. But it's right adjacent to Starved Rock State Park, where the Department of Natural Resources is in charge, and Matheson State Park, which is similar. So, Department of Natural Resources, or what was previously called the Department of Conservation, uh, has to be very careful how it responds to the commerce and the recreation and tourism. Uh, so it's a delicate balance, and traditionally, the Department of Natural Resources hasn't had a lot of money to work with these particular things. But Starved Rock State Park is on the Illinois River. There's a dam and lock there. You can go to the park and look over the dam and the lock. And it's surrounded by natural areas. You can look through a telescope at eagle nests. There's a rookery there. The eagles and other uh, wildlife knows that where the dam leaks out or is you have a spillway, there's an accumulation of fish, so it's good fishing at that point, and that's one of the attractions. Uh, the Department of Natural Resources has reestablished a portion of the canal. I'm not quite sure how long it is. I think it's less than a mile, but they looked at all the diagrams for how uh, boats were uh, built, and they built a replica. It was a volunteer effort. The boat, when it was finished, was named for the volunteers, or so volunteer action was helpful, and people can perhaps 100, 150 people can get onto this boat. It had to be lifted by a crane off a semi trailer into the lock and dam area, and that was achieved by uh, uh, too much applaud by the local communities that have benefited from this canal, and have communities that benefit from tourism. Uh, the canal is sometimes, or probably regularly, stocked with fish. So there are fishing competitions. There are other things to happen. The towpaths are bicycle ways, and there is a network of bicycle ways right into Chicago that make this an attractive tour. You can go right across to uh, the Quad Cities doing this sort of thing, and there are side traps, uh, and people do enjoy doing this. It probably doesn't have a lot of traffic in the virus era, but we hope that that will end. Uh, I'm trying to think what else to tell you about the canals. I don't know too much about the Erie Canal, but that was certainly well used for a while once again until the rails got into action. Uh, you have to know that Lake Michigan has some fairly big traffic, and uh, so it reaches right back up into Wisconsin and into Michigan, and can bring products down into the Mississippi. Uh, these days, the paddle wheelers have been replaced by uh, boats that have turbines, and uh, so they can negotiate, and they can negotiate the more modern uh, a Illinois shipping canal that comes through near to the Calumet River and may even involve the Calumet River. Uh, but one of the reasons for the activity was that wartime productions could be made in the middle of the country, away from the likelihood of uh, bombs and uh, access from Europe, which was in the Second World War. So, uh, therefore, even in its lesser days, got uh, funding to work with this. Uh, it could be a rather boring trip, but these days the Department of Natural Resources has been doing a very good job of reclaiming some of the bottomlands that are associated with the Illinois River and the Mississippi River, so that uh, the huge biology that was existed on that river could be reinstated. There's one at Hannibal, I think Hannibal. No, it's almost due west of us here, uh, and on 130, and it's a huge area of farmland that has been allowed to go back to nature with a little bit of encouragement here and there. The wildlife has come back in, and it's creating a much more healthy Mississippi. You did have the problem in Chicago that the uh, is referred to as the sanitary canal. Uh, Sewage could be let out into Lake Michigan, but then was let out into uh, the Illinois uh, Sanitary and Shipping Canal. I might not have all the names right, but this kind of polluted the uh, the area. But uh, the river is being reestablished. The dams make a difference in some places in Oregon and other states. The dams are being removed because they destroy the flow of the natural river that there were. And if those dams are not needed for uh, impoundments for canals, then they can be removed, and uh, people like Indians who uh, have permission to hunt and fish those corridors are more likely to be able to do that. Uh, so dams don't always get a favorable response. In Australia, as with in Colorado here, you have water laws, and often they mean that the the first person to pull water out of the river has the right to do so. And if you do that with uh, dams and irrigation, the upper reaches of the river can starve the lower end of the river. So uh, Colorado empties into the Pacific in Mexico, and if you keep taking water out for irrigation and for drinking purposes, then you are left with a salty drain that is not very effective for the people who early on settled on the river when it was a larger river. That is so in Australia, where you have coastal rivers that were flowing down steep escarpments, tapped and moved through tunnels through the mountains to the other side so that the internal dry area of Australia could be irrigated. In doing so, each drop could be used for uh, hydroelectricity. So, and there would be storage dams. One is called the Hume Reservoir. It's the sort of place where you could also have paddle wheels or shipping. It's so deep. Uh, Unfortunately, in a drought, it goes down, down, down. But uh, that dam provided irrigation water uh, all the way to the bight of Australia, where the Mississippi and the Murrumbidgee and the uh, uh, other rivers that the Lachlan and the Macquarie and other rivers that go into that Australian bight are starved of water. So we have to think uh, a lot about how much we deal with the uh, landscape and create more dams. And there's always a move to create a higher dam and a better, deeper water depths. And that argument goes on. And whereas the Army Corps of Engineers still owns the uh, area uh, between New Orleans and La Salle, Peru on the Illinois River, or Quad Cities on the Mississippi. Actually, there's also the Missouri River, which goes right up to the Rocky Mountains, and also has uh, one of the biggest, longest rivers in the world. And how do we use it? How do we preserve the forests on its embankment? Most of the forests that we had have been uh, decimated for the better trees. You took the 2 feet wide tree and left the other ones not necessarily to grow, but to be destroyed for the advantageous uh, lumber. Some of that lumber is uh, 15 inches by 15 inches, huge. And some of our wooden elevators contain those beams, and they can never be replaced again because some of those trees are 200 and 400 years old, and we're not going to get them back. It's a little bit like the Amazon, where rainforest is being removed. We did it first. The Australians did it first too. They took out the rainforest areas for the creation of coastal shipping boats and uh, to clear it, the land, as in uh, uh, the south, for cattle and grazing and uh, cropping. So I think I've uh, told you most of what I want to tell you about canals. They have a history. The Department of Natural Resources has uh, opportunities that they provide people to have a sense of what went on several generations ago. And it's axiomatic that that history should be preserved. And one of the books that you can get at places like Starved Rock are records made by families that had generations that helped to build the canal or to politic the canal, or and that information needs to be collected and archived. And so the state has archives, and libraries have archives, and you mightn't think that what is in your attic is not useful and interesting, but people who are archivists, or seriously people who have a mission of looking at what their relatives did in the past, they know what they're looking for. It might be the receipts that were generated by handwritten uh, balances uh, that told us what the prices was, how much was a railroad tie worth, how much was coffee worth, and you can follow uh, the time when it was realized that it was cheaper to move grain by barge than by train. Uh, so they know and have almost have formulas to look at so that they can find out what goes on. Uh, if you want to visit the area, it's rather wonderful. It goes from way up into Canada, uh, back down towards the uh, Gulf. Early on, there was a drive to find new animals, to find new plants, to have museums, and also to find what the headwaters were for the Mississippi. Actually, the Mississippi River, as it goes up to uh, Minnesota, is shorter than the Mississippi River, which goes uh, from the Missouri up to the Rockies. Uh, but the name uh, was maintained and is maintained today. But when you get to the uh, upper reaches, you have uh, abraded creeks and little reservoirs of uh, lakes, native lakes. Uh, some have been formed by uh, glaciation, where uh, they're called kettles. They go with moraines. So, moraine is where soil is dumped, and kettle is where the soil is excavated. So, if you want to find the headwaters, it's not one location, it's many locations. And you might for a while have uh, a stream, and then it all of a sudden becomes an abraded stream. And an abraded stream may go underground for many miles and then come out again. And so it was very difficult for early explorers to decide on what was the headwaters of the Mississippi. Same with the headwaters of the Missouri, although it's a little easier to study that because when you have a river, you need to have a slope, and the Rocky Mountains provided a very definite slope, and you could see where the creek started. And although as you get down stream, it looks like the river is running slower. Actually, the river is has more velocity and is running faster than the river that might be coming off a mountain with little waterfalls, and it looks as if it's running faster in the mountain, but in actual fact, it's running quite fast on its way out to the Gulf. It, it is it involves water, and invariably you have a cutting S-shaped curve, and that's where you can uh, allow a ship to uh, sail without fear of snags. Uh, but then on the other side, you have a beach. So if you're going to have a festival, you have trees up high on the bank that is being cut into. You can have a swing from a tree, and you can swing out and over into the deep water. I went to school with a place, there was a Georges River that had this sort of format, and we could swing. And if you were clever, you could do two somersaults before you entered the water. But if you were on the other side, you had that's where you had your barbecue and a beach, and you could uh, have a group of people there. So you had to go down the beach and across, and climb up an embankment before you could climb on the swing and enter the deep water by diving. Well, and when you have a large river like the Mississippi, you have that same sort of opportunity, and it allows for shipping. I'm going to cut now because I think uh, I forgot to set my clock, but I think we are getting towards the end, and I like to see WEF that supports our efforts, and Urbana Public Television get some uh, credence for what they do, and some fundraising effort. Uh, so this is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.